Is that how she killed you?
The film starts with a bedtime story about the creation of the world and its inhabitants, as the Bible teaches. Then, it takes place in the immediate aftermath of World War II, in 1945, in an isolated manor on the Channel Islands, New Jersey. Grace, a strict and detailed woman, wakes up from a nightmare and starts her day by welcoming 3 visitors into her home. Without asking about the purpose of their visit, she assumes they are in response to her recent ad for servants. The visitors, Mrs. Mills, Mr. Tuttle, and a mute young woman named Lydia, are treated as servants and given a house tour. Grace expresses her relief about their arrival as her previous servant disappeared without notice a week ago. As they move through the house, Grace locks each room after they leave it, revealing a key rule of the house. Grace has 3 main rules for her house. First, one door must be closed before opening another. Second, she values silence due to her migraines, and the house lacks electricity as they adapted to frequent power cuts during the war. Lastly, before introducing her children, Anne and Nicholas, who are photosensitive, she ensures all curtains are closed. Any exposure to sunlight can cause their skin to blister within minutes, so rooms must be darkened before they enter. The servants begin their duties immediately, with Miss Mills preparing breakfast for the children. During the meal, Anne believes that their mother, Grace, has gone mad since their father, Charles, went to war and never returned. Grace overhears this and reassures Mrs. Mills to ignore the children's comments. Grace then realizes that the letter she wrote seeking new servants was never mailed, leading her to question how Mrs. Mills knew about the job. Mrs. Mills explains that she was passing by in search of work, having previously worked for the house's former owners. I wouldn't say I like the sound of this. Grace warns Mrs. Mills about her children's weird and imaginative ideas. If you had weird ideas as a kid, subscribe to the channel. Later in the day, Grace instructs her children to study the Bible separately for better focus, explaining the importance of leading a good life. While they study, Grace is surprised by the sound of a child crying. She checks on Nicholas, who is calm, and Anne, who isn't crying either. However, Anne claims she heard the cries and mentions meeting a crying boy named Victor, who dislikes the house and wants them to leave. Anne also talks about Victor's father and others inspecting the house. Grace finds the story unbelievable, especially since the doors are always locked, but is surprised to see a door open. Angry, she confronts the servants, who insist they weren't in the house then. During the night, Anne wakes Nicholas, causing him to panic when he sees the open curtain. Anne claims Victor, an unseen entity, is responsible. This frightens Nicholas, who retreats to his bed while Anne closes the curtain. An argument between Anne and the unseen boy Victor further scares Nicholas. When Victor touches Nicholas, he screams, attracting Grace's attention. Finding a terrified Nicholas blaming Anne, Grace punishes her by making her read in the hallway. Despite Anne's insistence that she's telling the truth, Grace, tired of her ghost stories, makes her read the Bible until she apologizes to Nicholas. 3 days pass without Anne apologizing, insisting she's done nothing wrong. Meanwhile, Grace, trying to enjoy some peace, hears a disturbance upstairs. She calls for her servant Lydia to quiet down, but realizes Lydia and Miss Mills are outside. Puzzled, she investigates upstairs, where Anne claims Victor and his family are in the junk room. Grace cautiously enters, hearing whispers that seem to come from multiple people. Frightened, she uncovers the furniture to find them, but finds no one. When a door unexpectedly swings open, Grace rushes to encounter the intruders, but finds no one. She believes there are multiple intruders claiming the house as their own. Later, her daughter shows her a drawing of a family supposedly living with them in the house, including a father, a mother, and a little boy, and an intimidating older woman who invites Anne to join them. Convinced of the intruder's presence, Grace arms herself with a rifle and instructs her servants to open all curtains and thoroughly search the house. After an unsuccessful search, Grace finds an old family photo and death certificate documents in the junk room. She learns from former employee Mrs. Mills that taking these pictures was once common. Disturbed, Grace asks for the pictures to be removed. That night, she apologizes to her sleeping daughter, Anne. Nicholas, still awake, asks about their father's return, triggering Grace's unhappiness over her husband Charles' probable death. She spends the night crying, interrupted by the sound of a piano playing downstairs. She investigates, but the music stops as she enters the room. Haunted by paranoia, Grace locks the piano room only to be locked out when the door slams shut. In a panic, she calls for Mrs. Mills and is shocked to find the piano open again upon re-entering. Mrs. Mills tries to relieve her, suggesting that the living and dead worlds sometimes intertwine, a concept Grace struggles to accept. Convinced of a ghostly presence, she sets out to find a priest, ignoring Mrs. Mills' attempts to prevent her. On the way, she instructs the gardener, Mr. Tuttle, to search for gravestones. After she leaves, Tuttle questions her safety, but Mills assures him the fog will limit her journey. Suspiciously, Mills then instructs Tuttle to completely hide the gravestone. As the fog thickens in the woods, Grace is unable to proceed. Suddenly, a figure appears from the fog, her long-lost husband, Charles. Their joyful reunion makes Grace forget her quest to find a priest. She brings Charles home, surprising Mills. Charles greets his children and then spends the day lying in bed, clearly unwell. Later, during a meal, Grace dismisses the idea of ghosts and criticizes Anne for her beliefs, upsetting her. Mrs. Mills comforts Anne, confirming she's seen the intruders and hinting at upcoming changes. Grace begins to think that the intruders have left their house, which concerns Mills and the others. They believe convincing Grace will be the most challenging, complicating their plans. The following day, Grace has Anne wear a recently made veil. Anne adores it so much that she wishes to continue wearing it. After being left alone, Grace attends to her husband, who remains in bed and in bad shape. When she returns to Anne, she's startled to find her hands and face aged. This provokes Grace into a violent reaction, but upon removing the veil, she realizes she's been harsh with Anne. Mills intervenes, taking Anne away. Later, Mills gives Grace her usual migraine medication and reassures her that she'll handle the responsibilities. Grace grows suspicious of Mills and discards the pill she's been given when Mills leaves. Upon returning to the bedroom, she's confronted by Charles about a past incident of her being violent with the children. Grace insists on her love for her children and denies any violence. Charles, however, announces his departure to return to the front lines, upsetting Grace, who wishes for him to stay. He kisses her to soothe her, but by the following day, he's gone. A grieving Grace goes to the front gate, hoping to find him, but he's nowhere to be seen. Simultaneously, the children wake up to daylight, causing Anne to scream. Hearing her, Grace hurries to protect them, discovering all the curtains are gone. In a panic, she covers her children with a coat and moves them to the only dark room. She questions the servants about the incident, but they remain calm, suggesting the children might have outgrown their sensitivity to light. Overwhelmed with anger, Grace grabs a gun just as Mills and the others appear. She pulls the gun at the servants to stop their plans. She takes the room keys from them and dismisses them when they attempt to comfort her. Mrs. Mills suggests it's time to reveal the gravestones as they leave. Meanwhile, Grace spends the day searching for the missing curtains. At night, Anne tries to convince Nicholas that their mother has come back to her previous violent behavior, but Nicholas remains skeptical. Out of boredom, Anne decides to go outside and search for their father, with Nicholas joining due to his fear of being alone. The exploration leads them to 3 gravestones. Grace continues her search for the missing curtains and eventually uncovers a disturbing truth in the servants' quarters: death certificate photographs of Mrs. Mills, Mr. Tuttle, and Lydia. Simultaneously, Anne discovers that the gravestones belong to the 3 servants, revealing their ghostly identities. As the ghosts approach, the frightened siblings run to their mother, Grace. She urges them to seek shelter inside the house and attempts to shoot the ghosts, but to no effect. Mills informs Grace that they died from tuberculosis over 50 years ago. Upon hearing this, Grace retreats into the house and locks the door as the ghosts approach. She orders the spirits to leave and instructs her children to hide upstairs. Mrs. Mills explains the new reality of the house, that the living and the dead must coexist. However, Grace refuses to accept this and demands if they are indeed dead, they should let the living be. In response, the servants warn her that other intruders will live in the house even if they leave. Tuttle adds that these intruders are responsible for removing the curtains. While the children hide in a wardrobe, they are startled when an older woman opens it, causing them to scream. Mrs. Mills informs Grace that the intruders have located the children and urges her to confront them upstairs. Despite her fear, Grace encounters the intruders and her children upstairs. The elderly woman questions Anne about past events, but Nicholas tells Anne not to say anything. The elderly woman, who appears to be blind, is seen writing on paper. At the same time, two people observe their interaction and a couple watches. The woman asks Anne again about what their mother did to them, encouraging Anne to mention something about a pillow. The woman asks if that's how they were killed, shocking both the children and Grace. The woman then questions why they continue to stay in the house if they're dead, leading them to deny being dead. Grace, unable to maintain her composure, starts causing a ruckus in an attempt to persuade them. Suddenly, the scene shifts, revealing that the group at the table is conducting a seance, which confirms the true identity of the house's ghost. The individuals around the table, composed of paranormal experts and the actual homeowners, start to talk about the recent events. The wife expresses her frustration with the ongoing supernatural occurrences and advocates for relocating from the house. She begins to recount the history of previous occupants. It appears that the former owner lost her sanity and tragically murdered her own children. The wife also mentions that their son, Victor, has been plagued by nightmares and has reported sightings of a young girl in the house. Upon hearing this, the husband concedes and assures that they will vacate the house at the earliest opportunity, specifically the following morning. Outside the room, Grace comes to the shocking realization that she and her children have been dead all along, recalling the tragic incident where she killed her children and herself out of guilt. She accepts her ghostly existence just as Mrs. Mills enters, informing her that the current intruders are leaving. Still, others will come and must learn to live together peacefully. Now aware of their different state, the children enter the sunlight for the first time without harm. The story concludes with Grace and her children observing the intruders depart and the house is put up for sale. Now that's what I call a plot twist, and with that, the movie ends. If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.